Hello, everybody. So it's a fact, apparently universally acknowledged, that the Eustace Diamonds was Trollope's sensation novel. Well, I don't entirely agree. I think it was John Caldigate. I certainly found it so sensational that I could hardly bear to put it down, even though I was reading it while also on a walking holiday. Peter got an unasked for recap every day while we strode along through the magnificent scenery of the Swiss and Italian Alps, and I sat by the shore of Lake Como reading the stirring chapters featured in today's discussion. It's also, according to Trollope's biographer James Pope Hennessy, a superb detective novel, and I think that of that there can be no question. So the detection required in these central chapters is to establish whether or not John had committed bigamy when he married Hester Bolton. Already, sides have been taken, and there are many who are determined that John is guilty. It can't have helped his cause that Hester's own family have firmly decided against him, and the dreadful scenes at Puritan Grange with the attempt to kidnap her and keep her away from Folking will by now have become notorious in the district. One of the few really bright elements, though, is that John and his father have become fully reconciled, and that his father is convinced of his innocence and supports both John and Hester through this ordeal. Surprisingly, the trial, which is central to the story, only takes up 3 chapters. But this section is very much about what happens before and after the verdict, so falls neatly into 2. Part 1, innocent until proven guilty, which is chapters 40 to 43. So why had John paid over 20k just at the very worst moment? Even John can't quite convince himself that his motives were wholly pure, although he did genuinely feel, now that he knew about the mine's history, that he owed some restitution. It was no light matter to pay this. 20,000 in 1880 would be worth just shy of 2.5 million today. How much wiser would John have been had he not listened to the arguments of his brother-in-law, Robert Bolton, who is now his enemy? But how much less of a story there would have been. Trollope points out how much of John's life would not stand up well under the scrutiny of the courts, and that the difference between things that are merely talked about and those that are written down is very important. John had been foolish, very foolish, as we have seen on board the Goldfinder, and wicked too. It's going to look pretty grim in the court, and there will be those, quite apart from his mother-in-law, who will write him off as a hardened sinner. But the saving grace is that he had told his wife his story, and she had forgiven him. Just imagine his situation if he had not done that. I think it was very hard for John that his attorney didn't believe in his innocence, and of course told him how unwise he had been to pay the money, especially since the conspirators didn't leave England but stayed to enjoy their wealth. Trollope paints a wonderful picture, too, of the various groups in Australia, and I love the description of crinketers and Caldigateites, and of Mrs. Henniker, who was willing to swear either way about the marriage simply because she wanted a free passage home. I do sometimes wonder if Hester might be just a little too good. Perhaps Trollope had been infected by Dickens. But her relationship with Mr. Caldigate is so gentle that I can forgive our author. The sense of weariness waiting for the trial is exemplified by the phrase, the months of May and June and the first fortnight of July wore themselves away. And John meets his barrister. So really the trial is happening just about exactly now in the year. Sir John Joram, and fails to hear from him the conviction that he is innocent. This is not a good start to the proceedings for John. This must have been a sensational trial. What fun to see someone accused of bigamy, and especially when his wife was so young and had just had a baby. The description of Sir John's cross-examination of Euphemia is masterly. She is very cool, but he is very clever. And of course, she has to admit that she had written to tell John that she would marry Crinkett if John gave them the 20k. I had to do the best for myself. I did intend it, but I didn't do it. A woman can't be tried for her intentions. No, said Sir John, but she may be judged by her intentions. Crinkett has a hard time under examination, but at the end of the day, Mr. Seeley cannot give John much positive reason for hope, and Robert Bolton doesn't in the least doubt that John and Euphemia were married. On day 2 of the trial, the courtroom is even more crowded, and there is a general feeling that John had been married before, but that, as it was in Australia, it hardly counted. Trollope himself had visited mining districts in Australia and been lowered down a mine with his foot in the noose of a rope. He's quite a big man, so it must have been a very strong rope. He had seen the rigours of life in this wild west and had met an old Harrovian friend of his children who was living rough, as John Caldigate had done, and was possibly the sort of person he used for John Caldigate's character. He had also seen the drunken behaviour of miners who had struck lucky. It seems that this sense of life being so different as hardly to count in England was quite rife. The witnesses on day 2 weren't much use, and the jury were no nearer to knowing whether or not a marriage had taken place in the tent at Ahalala. Now, we come to the nub of the evidence, a letter allegedly posted in an envelope that was postmarked at Sydney and was addressed by John to Mrs. Caldigate. Did he actually post that letter? In a masterly speech, Sir John takes the court through the changes that occur to postmark stamps and points out that this stamp is so perfect that it has probably been forged. I'd love to have the time to read out the whole of Sir John's speech, as it is so brilliant, but instead I'll just advise everyone to read it through to themselves again. What a wordsmith. But, as Trollope says, that John should have been a bigamist would be a pity. Oh, such a pity, the pity of it. Oh, the pity of it. But who is the learned lawyer who speaks on day 3 of the trial? Judge Bramber, and he clearly directs the jury as to his expected verdict. He makes it clear that in his view, the greed and criminality of the 4 conspirators does not necessarily detract from their veracity as to the marriage. And oh dear, the fact that John paid them the money, but only once they were in England, seems to imply John's guilt rather than theirs. The judge dismisses the postmark evidence as almost worthless and points out that the envelope without any postmark would have been strong evidence anyway. Not a single point was made in John's favour, and he was, of course, found guilty. Which brings us on to part 2, a guilty man. I find it fascinating that Trollope doesn't write at all about John's fate. He just says he disappeared with the jailers down the steps leading to regions below and away to his prison. And they knew that he would no more be seen or heard of for 2 years. And that's it. We don't know if he was sewing mailbags, breaking stones, or just looking at a wall. Indeed, instead, it is Hester's fate that is under discussion, and the general consensus is that she must go back to her parents' house. But Hester says, they cannot make me believe myself not to be his wife. I'm glad that Mrs. Robert Bolton was so kind to her, even though she was still on the going home side of the argument. Of course, Hester's mother has a great opportunity to express the sort of Bible-bashing views which Trollope found so abhorrent. But it's Mr. Smirky who takes a biscuit in his role as overzealous clergyman. He uses his connection with Mr. Bromley as an excuse to go to Utterdon and try to convince him of John's guilt. But Mr. Bromley is as sure of John's innocence. So Mr. Smirky manages to see Mr. Caldigate, who sends him off with a flea in his ear. I love the way in which Mr. Caldigate answers a letter from the mayor, who has said, "Greatly as I object to all interference in families," by saying, "Dear Mr. Mayor, if you have an objection to interfere in families, why do you do it?" Nevertheless, Mr. Caldigate is so much aware of what is being said that he does suggest to Hester that perhaps she should go back to her parents. But Hester is resolute, and so they continue together in a supportive friendship. We then turn to the dreadful situation in which Mrs. Bolton finds herself and her conviction that John is guilty, but that she too is guilty for having tried to make Hester's life pleasant instead of all sackcloth and ashes as she believed life generally should be. She goes on and on at her poor husband, convinced that he and his sons should be able to work on Hester to abandon her husband. When William, the London barrister, writes to Hester, her reply is so well worded that Fanny, William's wife, is brought round to Hester's point of view. But although Mr. Bolton has told her that they have no power at all, Mrs. Bolton is determined to see her daughter and to change her mind. She puts on a black dress. There are women who seem always to be burying someone, and Mrs. Bolton, as she went forth to visit her daughter, was fit to bury anyone. It is not an easy visit, and neither mother nor daughter can have got much comfort from it. Hester explains that she has been convinced by answer to prayer. But of course, Mrs. Bolton can't accept that. They who send others to the throne of heaven for direct advice are apt to think that the asking will not be done aright unless it be done with their spirit and their bias. Alas, for Mrs. Bolton, she has to go home defeated and is unable any more to blame her husband and his sons for their lack of success. But suddenly, in chapter 47, we enter a newer and happier realm. Sir John is still persevering with the trial, and in this he is aided and spurred on by one of the two clerks who had given evidence at the trial. Trollope's time at the post office gives him an insight into its workings that is absolutely invaluable to the plot. I simply can't imagine what those clerks were doing in respect of the postmarks, but it seems to take up all their time. And then Bagwax was able to spend weeks working on evidence after the trial had finished. Not only that, he was to go to Sydney on a wonderful journey and with expenses. The description of jealousy in the office is brilliant and very funny, but I love the portrait of Bagwax with his honest conviction that the envelope is false and his concern for both the prisoner and his wife. By the way, the post office building is still in St. Martin's le Grand and might indeed be a circumlocution office. I mean, it's huge, but probably not the same building that was there in the 1880s because it's pretty much a great big concrete building now. Anyway, the interaction between Curlydown, the clerk whose evidence had been so unhelpful, and Bagwax, with his enthusiasm for justice, is very funny. But it is when Bagwax says that he has conclusive evidence and must go to Sydney that Curlydown has his own back. If it is conclusive, I don't see why you should go to Sydney at all. If your proof is so perfect, why should that fellow be kept in prison while you are running about the world? By the time you're back from Sydney, Caldigate's time will be half out. Why don't you let Sir John see your proof? You don't want to lose your trip, I suppose. Bagwax realises that, although Curlydown has only made the point through envy, he is nevertheless right. So he nobly makes up his mind to go at once to Sir John Joram. So Bagwax, sure that his postmark evidence is a clincher, packs up all the envelopes that he has gathered for comparison and goes off to see Sir John. He has a chat to Sir John's clerk and gets a bit carried away. England expects that every man this day shall do his duty. In repeating those memorable words, Bagwax raised his voice. Sir John don't like to hear anything through the partition, Mr. Bagwax. I beg pardon, but whenever I think of that glorious observation, I am apt to become a little excited. It'll go a long way, Mr. Jones, in keeping a man straight if he'll only say it to himself often enough. Yeah, but not to roar it out in an eminent barrister's chamber. So Bagwax, in all his zeal, persuades Sir John to look at the postmarks. Should he be less ready to devote himself to his client, he who was paid for his work, than this post office clerk who was as pure in his honesty as he was zealous in the cause? The energy, the zeal, the true faith of the man were admirable. Sir John was half disposed to rise from his seat to embrace the man and hail him as his brother, only that, had he done so, he would have made himself as ridiculous as Bagwax, and zeal is always ridiculous. But Sir John respects Bagwax and tells him so, although he's not convinced that they will be able to overturn a verdict with this evidence of perjury. But there's a cliffhanger. Bagwax, on his way home, suddenly realises something. But you're going to have to wait, because things are afoot elsewhere. We return to the Shand family and find that Maria, unlike Julia Smirkey, will not believe in John's guilt. It happens that even the married sisters are at the family home and discussing the verdict one afternoon when a stranger appears. It is Dick. The first thing to do with a prodigal is to kiss him, and the next to feed him. And during this time, Dick has heard nothing of the trial and is astonished. As sure as my name is Richard Shand, John Caldigate never married that woman. Dick explains that Euphemia had become greedy for gold and drink, so that John and she had quarrelled and parted before the alleged marriage in May. I do think this is perhaps one slightly weak bit in the story, in that Euphemia's character is never absolutely developed. We see her on the boat and she's always alluding to some shady past, but we never know what it is. In fact, we never even know that truly she's a widow. She might still be married anyway to the actor that she'd left. And then we see her being very sort of captivating on the boat and beautiful and young, and then she turns to this greedy woman who's very fond of alcohol. I suppose gold has very bad effects on people, and so does alcohol, so perhaps that explains it, but there we are. Anyway, so Dick writes to Mr. Seeley to explain the history and states that in May 73 they certainly were not man and wife. I suspect that many lawyers struggle to believe in the innocence of their clients, and Mr. Seeley didn't think much of either Dick's evidence nor of Bagwax's. But he does his duty by John and reports to Sir John Joram, who has already been swayed by Bagwax's evidence. Now comes this man, whom we should all have believed had he been present at the trial, and tells this story. I find it surprising that Mr. Seeley thinks Dick's return is opportune and possibly a plant and a plot, since he would have been accepted as a witness if he'd been at the trial in the first place. Now, when John has been convicted, he has a much harder part to play. He must help to overturn a verdict, and his word will be opposed to the words of 4 other persons. 4 perjured scoundrels! I found the conversation between Sir John and Dick totally believable. Even though Sir John is on his side and believes him, Sir John, as a lawyer, recognises that not everyone will, and he has to calm Dick down. It's absolutely understandable as well that Dick should be aggrieved at the idea that his story may not be accepted. And yet, we find that Mr. Seeley is still certain that Dick has been put up to this, possibly by old Mr. Caldigate, and is assuming that, even if John is pardoned, he, Mr. Seeley, will not believe his innocence. Dick then finds that his return is not seen in a favourable light by everyone. He finds it astonishing that the Boltons, their views strengthened by Hester's mother, seemed to want to persist in believing in John's guilt. But to Hester, he was as an angel from heaven. Mr. Caldigate realises that overturning the verdict won't be simple and recognises that Mr. Seeley thinks that he has connived with Dick. Again, though, you'd think that they'd realise it would have been simpler and better to have done this before the trial. Anyway, one of the aspects of this book is how skillfully Trollope sees into the minds of its characters. Robert Bolton is all the more emphatic in his belief that John is a bigamist because he is angry with himself for having introduced John to his family. He now felt it was his duty to oppose the pardon because this belief had gone so deep with him. Though I don't know how he thought that would help Hester and her baby, but there we are. And Dick can't believe this attitude. Here's a man who, even for the sake of his own sister, won't hear the truth just because he hates his sister's husband. What have I got to get by lying? I'm delighted to say, however, that Mr. Bolton believes in John's innocence, and so does faithful Mr. Holt, the farmer, and his vehement support carries most of Cambridge to John's side. Alas, not all that Dick can say will at first convince Aunt Polly and Julia. Their sense of wrong is too deep-rooted to allow John any mercy. And good old Mr. Smirky has something fine and unchristian to say about Dick's drinking habits. And I rather love the theme of the yellow trousers working against Dick, too. They come in for quite a lot of stick from all parties. The squire, then, does believe Dick, and he offers to write to his MP to accelerate the process, although good old Smirky persists in saying that Hester should still think of John as a bigamist because a jury had said so. If only Dick had come home in time for the trial. But we're going to round off today with Mr. Bagwax and his extraordinary discovery. He suddenly realises on the way home for Sir John Joram that the stamp is the issue, not the postmark. It was manufactured and sent to Australia after the date of the postmark. The document was then fraudulent. And the 4 witnesses who had convinced the jury to convict John had been perjurers. Then the scene in the office is priceless. Bagwax. It becomes more wonderful every day. It's very wonderful to me that a man should be able to sit so many hours looking at one dirty bit of paper. Every moment that I pass with that envelope before my eyes, I see the innocent husband in jail and the poor afflicted wife weeping in her solitude. Oh, you'll be going on the stage, Bagwax, before this is done. Curlydown was envious of Bagwax's new position and also cross because he wanted to go home and count the plums on his wall, but he was having to do extra work because Bagwax was working on the evidence. But Bagwax wins him round by a spot of diplomacy and goes down to Apricot Villa, where presumably they count the plums together. And certainly Bagwax becomes engaged to Jemima Curlydown. He will go to Sir John Joram on Monday, and the case surely must be reopened. So it's just like Dogberry and the Watch. What your wisdoms could not discover, these shallow fools have brought to light. Perhaps a little unfair on Bagwax, but you get my meaning. I often like to divide the talk into themes, but I've gone for the straightforward approach today because this, the central nub of the book, has such a clear narrative thread. Looking back, though, there are clearly some overriding themes to consider. One is the strong current of disbelief in John's innocence. This isn't about whether he behaved well or badly in relation to Euphemia, whether he was moral or not, but whether he was legally married to her. If he was not, he was quite at liberty to marry Hester, whatever society may think of his morals. And remember what Trollope said about how much more damning things look once written down. He had admitted his past faults to Hester, and she had accepted them as part of his character. And that should be enough for everyone else. The poor timing of various elements. Why had John paid the money so late? How had Bagwax missed the date of the stamp before the trial? Why did Dick come home too late for the trial? Of course, the answer to this is that there wouldn't be much of a story if everything had worked out nicely at first. And then the very strong vein of humour that runs throughout this tense and exciting story. Perhaps we can't laugh at Mrs. Bolton, but I think we can at Mr. Smirky, and to some extent Julia. The yellow trousers keep cropping up too, but it's the scenes with what we might call the rude mechanicals at the post office that take the biscuit. I think Trollope must have heard this sort of chat among his fellow workers, and he remembers it with a kindly good humour that still respects them. It's been a joy to read through these pages again, and I've really enjoyed it, and I hope everyone else has too. Thank you. Oh, discussion starters, sorry. So, should John have paid that 20k? Is the character of Euphemia well developed? Why didn't Mr. Seeley believe John's innocence? And conversely, why was Sir John Joram prepared to believe it? Is Bagwax the true hero of the book? And finally, would you like to have Mrs. Bolton as a mother or a mother-in-law? And that's it finished. Thank you.